So today we have Dr. Shane Kraus here, and we are going to be talking about gambling disorder among U.S. military veterans, clinical considerations. So I'm going to let Dr. Kraus take it away.
Okay, so hi. Okay, great. So hi, everybody. My name is Shane, and I'm an assistant professor here at UNLV. And I study problem gambling. So I do a lot of research and work in gambling and problem gambling among military and veterans. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about that today, and I'm excited. And if you have questions, definitely keep them. We're going to have time to go through them. These slides, you will have them access to you, and they have a lot of resources in them. So don't feel the need to kind of type, write anything down. You will have access to all these slides. So I do get research funding to support my work here from different various funders in the last couple of years. Again, it doesn't influence kind of what I say or what I do, but just letting you know that I do get research funding for kind of the research that I do in problem gambling as well. So our goals today, we have a couple goals and we have some objectives. Our goals are to understand the clinical profile of U.S. veterans experiencing gambling disorder. We also want to gain knowledge and best practices for screening and treatment. So in a sense, what should we be doing for those veterans who are reporting problems with gambling disorder or problem gambling? And objectives here, we're going to talk about the literature, particularly the research, some of the research, just a little bit of research. I'm going to talk about effective screening tools, even some that I've actually studied with veterans. And then we're also going to review some treatment approaches for gambling disorder. And I'm going to kind of give you some resources for you to also consider if you are also a clinician or doing advocacy for this area. So, okay, so I'm going to jump in and then you let me know. And then if you have questions, I think you can let me know or type them in and we can respond to them. But I will make sure I leave time at the end. So we know gambling is a range, right? So we know that some people don't gamble. Some people do what we call recreationally, and then some people have what we call disordered or clinically significant. And it kind of goes from mild, moderate to severe. And what we know is that treatment, right, needs to match where they are on in terms of disorder. So for those who, if we look at the graph for health promotion, that is where we're trying to promote healthier or non-problematic strategies around gambling, responsible strategies, harm reduction. Going into harm reduction, how do people set limits? What are things they can do? And then when people start to really have what we call problem gambling, some issues with gambling to gambling disorder, we want to then offer brief treatments all the way to psychotherapy or intensive psychopharmacology and medication. And I'm going to talk about that. But the secret here is you got to match where the person is with what you're going to offer. Okay, and we'll talk about that as well. So we know gambling disorder, this is the criteria. This is the same for DSM-5-TR. It was just recently revised. And it consists of the symptom of persistent and recurrent problematic gambling, a behavior leading to clinically significant impairment, right? At least exhibiting 4 symptoms out of 9 for at least 12 months. So one of them, I normally ask people in the audience, but we can't do it today. I put one of them in red, and that is often returning another day to get even or to win. It's called loss chasing. And I think the reason I put that one red is that is actually one of the strongest predictors of someone with an issue. So although there's 9 symptoms, increasing amount of money to achieve desired excitement, restless irritability when trying to stop, unsuccessful efforts to quit, cut back, thinking a lot about gambling and since craving, gambling when upset. Often returning loss chasing is actually the strongest predictor. So if I'm working with someone and they'll say, well, I'm going to go back the next day to get the money back I lost, that raises the hair on the back of my neck. That to me is a big red flag. And that's one that I really want you to be screening or having a conversation with someone. And this holds for veterans as well. So that's kind of a strong. And the other symptoms are lying to conceal, involvement with gambling, jeopardizing, losing relationships, and borrowing money. So again, there's 9 symptoms. You just have to have 4. 4 to 5 means you have mild, moderate is 6 to 7, severe is 8 to 9. Again, people can have different symptoms for the experience, but again, loss chasing, the one in red, I think is probably one of the most important ones to focus on. So gambling disorder prevalence, and we're going to pivot here to veterans pretty quickly. So we know most people gamble recreationally, in their lifetime at least, even if it's like lottery, things like that. Problem gambling. So when we use the term problem gambling, what does that mean? Well, that means someone's having a couple symptoms, or maybe they're, struggling with setting a limit or cutting back or quitting or loss chasing, So when people have less than 4 symptoms, we call that problem gambling, right? So it's kind of subthreshold. And in people's general lifetime in the US population, it's about 2 to 5% for adults. But with veterans, our research, we've written on this as well, it's about 10%. So veterans are generally 2 to 3 times more higher probability than civilians. Gambling disorder, so these are people who meet criteria, 4 of the 9 in the last sometime in their life. It's much higher in college, university students there, and US samples, it's about 1 to 2%. It's pretty low, but again, it varies a lot. But veterans, it's at least 3%. Again, veterans are much higher, often double or triple the rates for a problem or gambling disorder. Sadly, only about a third of people with problem gambling actually experience natural remission, meaning they don't get better. They get better without other supports or help, such as treatment or resources. So most people who have gambling problems suffer for a long time until they're able to use resources to help them. So we know gambling disorder is highly comorbid with many mental health issues. So I always tell people, gambling disorder, it kind of is like bananas. It comes in bunches, meaning someone often doesn't just come in with gambling. They often come in, as you see in the first slide, with mood, depression, substance use, PTSD. PTSD is very important for veterans. We're going to talk about that. There is some elevated risk for personality traits, although I think that's pretty low. But what we're also seeing is it's related to reduced quality of life, bankruptcies, just really poor psychological functioning. Interestingly, though, for our veterans that we're working with, so these are, when I use the term veteran, it's the individuals who've served in the U.S. Armed Forces, have been discharged, they're no longer active duty, and those individuals, we see very high rates of substance use disorder, like alcohol over 70%, cocaine, opioids, and cannabis. So I think when we're screening, we're often not screening for gambling disorder in substance use clinics, trauma clinics, and so on. So again, if you're not screening for gambling and just broad mental health programs, you're likely missing it. So gambling disorder looks very similar to some degree in military populations. When I use the term military populations, that includes active duty. I would just say there's very little data on problem gambling or gambling disorder in active duty, those who are currently under contract for the U.S. Armed Forces. So we really have much more data on those who are post-discharge, who are no longer in the military. But they look very similar. So we'll just kind of use a broader term here. So we recently actually just published a paper looking at 401 U.S. veterans seeking treatment for problem gambling, actually in Cleveland. And we found 41% reported PTSD, a third had substance use, 1 in 5 had depression, and at least almost 3/4 of them had at least one psychiatric disorder, and about 1 in 4 had 2, and about 10%, 9% had 3 or more. Again, that means there's a lot of psychiatric comorbidity. So when you're working with veterans, you're going to see elevated rates of psychiatric mental health issues. So you really want to keep that in mind. We know some of the prior work that 40% of U.S. veterans seeking treatment have reported a previous suicide attempt. We've seen that in some of our work that we're currently working on as well. So we should definitely be screening as well. I don't know that the helplines and the suicide prevention hotlines are screening for gambling. I think that's something that we need more data on and we can talk about later. Other studies, just really briefly, have found 2% of U.S. veterans having at-risk gambling, and as well as 1 in 4 veterans with gambling had chronic homelessness. Again, we do have a lot of programs that are serving veterans who are homeless, but we're not actually understanding why are they homeless. And gambling is definitely one of the reasons they are actually they are homeless, because they're spending all their money and losing their housing as well. Just really briefly, I'm going to go through this quickly, but I just put this here to show you that now that there's been more literature evolving with the UK, so United Kingdom military, and guess what? They're finding this similar patterns. They're looking at those who've served in the UK Armed Forces, and guess what? They're finding their UK veterans are 10 times more likely to report problem gambling. So again, different country, those who've served as well, many of them overseas, and they're having similar problems, and they're often using gambling to cope with distress and other mental health issues. So this is a UK sample, but it looks very, very similar to the US sample. And again, PTSD and complex PTSD here are really a big risk factor for problem gambling, same as we found in the US. Fast forward to the Australian Defence Force members, and we're seeing something similar as well. Although the rates prevalence are about 2% of veterans, that's about what we found in one of our another paper, reported issues with problem gambling. So again, something similar. I just point this out that there's not a huge literature on veterans, international veterans and gambling, but this is an issue to be thinking of, particularly around post-traumatic stress disorder, mental health issues, and the elevated rates of gambling among those who've served in some kind of military capacity. So, and I was just mentioning earlier, I do some work in Israel as well and other places with military, and we have similar trends across different languages, cultures, and places. So this is kind of, maybe many of you know this, but right now the US operates slot machines overseas on bases, and they earn about $100 million. This is actually what they make in earnings and winnings. So it's much higher actually, but it's $100 million slot machines overseas, and that money they use for morale and welfare and recreation. Unfortunately, they're not really actually necessarily providing problem gambling, responsible messaging, things like that. So I point this out because we're often seeing trends of earlier problem gambling initiating early in someone's military career. So I think this is something to think about. And sadly, if you click this link, the Government Accountability Office screening. There we go. Okay, good. Yeah. So I think there's lack of standard screening right now happening in the military, despite it actually being required. So we can talk about that, but I think it's really important to know that we have a long way to go for that as well. Okay, so I'm going to briefly show you a couple of research slides, but we are going to get to the clinical stuff. But I think it's important to tell you what we're finding with our research. So we have a big project from the ICRG. It's a sports wagering. So, sports betting is a big thing. New York legalized it in, I think, 2022. Nevada has been doing it for quite some time. So we recruited 2 samples from this longitudinal study. One is a US sample of 2,800 adults matched on the US Census. The other one is a sports wagering sample. Okay, and this includes those who are active duty or veterans themselves. So what I want to show you here is, well, how are they different, and are there mental health issues between them, right? So first we say, okay, you can see here on the slides here, we have totally 567 military, those who've served in the military, either active duty, compared to 3,796 people. So that's about right. Our population for veterans is about 10 or 11%. Here we have 13%. So again, this is not important. Just to show you, I want to show you, we have enough people to compare. These are veterans, not in VA. They're in the community out there in New York, where they're from all 50 states represented. So we're going to compare them to civilians. Okay. So we looked at a couple things. One is the NIDA Quick Screen Assist. It's a measure that you can actually look up if you're interested, and it screens for substance use. It's a very good measure. We also added behaviors, pornography, video game play as well. And we looked at those who endorsed past year engagement. So have they done these things? And then also 3-month problematic symptom use, okay? So you can see 3-month frequency, desire, urges to use, has the substance use or behavior cause social legal issues, consequences, failing to do what's normally expected, someone's expressed concern, and fail to control come out. So these are kind of symptoms we think from DSM-5, and we looked at 12-month frequency. Okay, so just what we did. So for problem gambling, we use the measure, which I'll talk about later. It's called the Problem Gambling Severity Index, the PGSI. It's very simple. It's a 9-item screener. I'll show you later. It has a great cutoff score. So 0 is no issues, low risk, moderate risk, moderate is 3 to 7, and problem gambling or someone with a score of 8 or higher It's been well studied, well validated. It's a really solid measure. So we'll talk about it, but it's one that I would definitely recommend you screening for and using that within your programs, your advocacy. Okay, so really, really quickly here, this doesn't say too much other than that our samples, we have our veterans, our civilians. That's our active duty is in the first column. They are different, but they're supposed to be different. You know, we would expect our civilians to be, our active duty be younger than our veterans and our civilians. So this kind of makes sense, right? So this is not statistically important. I just wanted to show you this is our sample. And you can see they're relatively pretty similar for, you know, being white or African Americans across the board. So they're just showing you that the education is pretty similar. Okay, so also same thing here. We see that, you know, pretty similar rates for single or marriage, employment status. Civilians are active duty are more likely to be working, which makes sense. And capacity, again, similar diversity in terms of that. So again, just showing you the sample, not critical. But here's what's critical. So when we say, okay, we have the problem gambling severity index, remember a score of 8 is severe. That is going to be where I drew a little crude arrow. And what you see, civilian population right now, across all of our people, so 2 samples, we have 19% of the civilian sample has problem gambling. Now remember, we recruited people for sports wagering, so this is not a true prevalence, but what's interesting is look at the rate for military, it's 28%. So this is definitely elevated. So here you can see right away, we're seeing higher rates of problem gambling severity in military and veterans here. Again, this is the same slide here. You can see showing you the same thing, 18.7% compared to 28%. So right away, that's a pretty much elevated rate. And we really shouldn't expect to see that unless there's likely a problem within this group. And there is. So the next thing is, of those 567, the question is, what are they doing? And actually the most common, so if you say, look at the blue is, I've done it within the past 12 months. The most common for military status is going to be lotteries, followed by slot machines, and then also by sports betting. So more or less, veterans here are gambling pretty regularly. You know, yes is, you know, out of this is 250 would be 50%. So you can see this is a sample that's, you know, most people are, half of them are gambling regularly or some capacity. But these are the areas where I would be thinking, particularly sports wagering and slot machines and lottery, I might be looking at veterans or prevention programs for high-risk behaviors. Okay, so last heavy slide, I promise. So what we did is we said, okay, what alcohol, tobacco, prescriptions, so you can see on the left side, cannabis, illegal drugs, pornography, all these behaviors. What it predicts veteran status, meaning we compare civilians to veterans. And what we see is that veterans have a 1.5 increased odds of having an alcohol problem, a little bit for tobacco, 1.29, double the risk for prescription drugs, double the risk for cannabis, marijuana, 1.6 times odds for legal behaviors. Pornography is actually 1.7%. Gambling is about 1.5, and again, video games. So what this means is you would say, well, overall, all across all the behaviors, these are elevated among those with military experiences or backgrounds. So it isn't just gambling it's really screening and advocating for all of these substance use and behavioral addictions, not just gambling, because again, it's comorbid, it's all runs together. So takeaway from this quick here is those with military experiences. So again, we collapsed active duty and veterans here, had higher rates of engaging in sports betting, which I think is important for us to talk about. Those in U.S. military veterans reported higher levels of problem gambling compared to civilians. The most common behaviors we saw were lottery, live action, sports wagering, and slot machines. Military populations relative to civilians had increased odds here for various mental health symptoms, 3-month symptoms for substance use and addictive behavioral addictions. And again, takeaway message, right? Further screening outreach program public health efforts here are really needed. So again, from this study, I think it's really important to show that we really should be looking at lots of issues, not just problem gambling, but again, think of that issues like bananas that come in bunches as well, okay? So I'm gonna tell you next. So I work with a collaborator, Dr. Joshua Grubb at University of New Mexico, and we're doing a project at the Cleveland Clinic. They have the residential program. It's fantastic for problem gambling. And we recently looked at some data. We're currently working on this for publication. We looked at 665 veterans. Their average age was about 54, mostly men, Army, there's branches differences. And we wanted to understand what are the problems that they're actually going to residential treatment for. And you can see electronic machines, games, lottery, non-strategy gambling, and more strategy-specific gambling. So these are kind of across the behaviors you see here. Substance use disorders, again, are very, very high. So lottery players, we're going to talk about lottery, and New York has a very large active lottery, so I think we should be talking about that. We see higher substance those veterans who with lottery history coming for lottery problems have higher substance use, whether it's you can see past substance use, current alcohol, nicotine, and really also polysubstance use. So again, those veterans with lottery behaviors have a lot of comorbidity for substance use. So I'm going to keep going here. So comorbid, so what are the reasons there? What are the comorbidities? And not surprising, we see similar rates. So non-lottery players, we actually higher rates of PTSD than lottery, but again, they're well over 40%. Personality, non-lottery players have a little bit higher personality issues. I'm sorry. And again, it's pretty similar rates across the board, although look at this current suicidal ideation, regardless of whether you're a lottery veteran with problematic lottery player or not, the current suicide is 25 to 29%. So pretty high. So definitely problematic. Cognitive distortions are also problematic, meaning, lottery players have more expectancies around what they're going to win or maybe what they can gain or benefit from. They also have more difficulty stopping. They just really can't, or they're struggling to stop themselves. Oops, hang on, sorry, I didn't mean to go. Again, these other ones are not statistically different, but again, it's showing these are kind of elevated rates for what we call cognitive distortions. What are fallacies or beliefs that people might have around gambling? So, and if you're going to do public outreach or public prevention, you have to target those cognitive distortions, okay? So here conclusions just from this simple thing we did here. Lottery behavior is common among, US veterans. Getting treatment for gambling disorder, lottery is associated with substance use problems, and it's associated with gambling related cognitions. Again, I mention this because I think these are where we should be screening substance use programs in New York, these other areas. This is where intervention and public health should be focused. And we can talk about that in a minute. So do we want to maybe just take a hot second and pause and see if anyone has a question? Does anyone have a question? Whether I can check chat.
Yeah, there was two questions in the one question in the chat, actually. I think it was just a clarification. They wanted to know the natural remission, the figure of 1/3 is for subclinical problem gambling, not diagnosed gambling disorder, correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I think gambling disorder is even lower. So I think I can find it, but it's, I think, under like 15%. It's pretty low. Yeah, our veterans is 5%. We publish on that, 5%. So it's very low. Yeah, it's really low. Yeah, people, I think, really need resources. The question is, they always need problem gambling. Like, do they need treatment? We're going to talk about that, like psychotherapy versus GA or other resources. I think that's an important discussion we can have. And I think lots of things work for different people. So we should talk about that. Okay, anything else?
That was the only question. Just another comment, but that was it.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm a big advocate on screening. So I always, when I train people, including my own PhD students or programs I work a lot with, the thing about gambling is that people don't generally go to treatment for it until it's quite bad, meaning often I don't have a slide on it here, but the average onset to seek treatment is about 8 to 10 years, right? It takes a long time to get help. So but what's interestingly is that we know they're more likely to get screened for depression if they're a veteran, depression, PTSD, and substance use issues. So if we're screening in those programs and we talk and create space around gambling, we're likely to see also problem gambling emerge. So we really have to think about screening in a different capacity. So one of the screeners that I really like, we published on it for veterans, so it's been published with veterans. It looks quite good. There's 4 or 5 papers with it. It's a brief biosocial gambling screen here. If you click on this slide as well, you'll be able to get access to it. And actually, this organization often mails them out as magnets. So I bet you'll be able to get them from them for your office if you email them. They're pretty great. So it's a 3-item screener. If they say yes to anything, you really need to follow up with them. So here you go. During the past 12 months, have you become restless, irritable, anxious when trying to cut back? Have you tried to keep your family or friends from not knowing how much you gamble? And during the past 12 months, have you had financial problems resulting from gambling? The first item, number 1, is actually the most strongest predictor of an issue. So I think if they say yes to any of them, I would further screen them. But again, I think one of the things we don't do is we'll just say things like, well, you don't have a gambling problem, do you? Right? So we need to think about asking open questions like, hey, how do you like to have fun and relax? Or something like, do you have any concerns about your gambling, or has anyone expressed concerns? So often people might say, well, someone else has expressed concerns about their gambling, but it's not uncommon for veterans to not identify having a problem with gambling, even if they're in a treatment facility here. Las Vegas has a residential program. It's not unusual to say, well, I don't think I have an issue, but these other people do. So thinking about how you phrase it, or if they're having issues with housing or financial money management, I might say, well, how are you spending your money? And be looking for things that are probably related to gambling as well. But we often ask loaded questions like, well, you don't have an issue, right? And because that's really, we're uncomfortable with that issue, but that shuts down the opportunity to do that. We did a study in primary care. We did a screening study in VA, first kind of one. We published it. We found about 2% of veterans we screened at primary care had at-risk problem gambling. And in those we identified with gambling, I think all 3 of the, I think 3 or 4 of the people, mostly, I think all had active suicidal ideation. That was not known because it wasn't disclosed, but it came out through gambling. So I think standard screening, the screener takes less than a minute to do, I think is really to our benefit. As I mentioned earlier, there's other screening tools. The Problem Gambling Severity Index, the PGSI, I like quite a bit. It's 9 items. Again, it has 3 different groups here. It's also in English and Spanish and a number of languages as well. And it really does have a nice cutoff score of 8 that has been shown to be maps on pretty well to clinical issues. Although moderate risk gamblers, people with moderate issues, I think are also important to have conversations with and help. And there are other tools here, the Nordic Diagnostic Screen for gambling, or the Massachusetts Gambling Screen. They're available, but personally, I use the PGSI quite a bit in my own work because it's pretty helpful. We've been publishing on it as well. And with veterans, it seems to be working well for us. So also here, again, here's some separate things. Have you bet more than you can afford to lose? Have you needed to gamble larger amounts, right, to get the excitement? That's kind of the tolerance thing. And have you gone back the next day to try to win back your money, right? So again, that's loss chasing, which we know is definitely probably the strongest predictor to look at. So unfortunately with gambling disorder, there's not really a gold standard medication. So a lot of people ask me, well, when does someone need a medication? And I often think that, and we'll talk about this, that most individuals who are struggling likely would benefit from psychotherapy or other interventions before medication, although someone in therapy and treatment and medication is a better outcome than just medication only. But if you have to pick a medication that has the best promise, I would say, and we published on this as well, it's probably going to be an opioid antagonist called naltrexone, and it's in an oral form or injectable as Vivitrol. We're currently doing some work here in Las Vegas looking at Vivitrol for gambling disorder comorbid with opioids and alcohol use disorder. So I think naltrexone has probably some benefit. There's been other evidence for other things like atypical antipsychotics, things like that. There's short-term benefits, but again, generally not long-term. I think there's really not great evidence that medication is often necessary, but I think it depends on the comorbidity. If you have someone with active depression who's very depressed, giving them an SSRI for depression might also help them, particularly if gambling is a coping mechanism for low mood or depression. So do we have a question here? I think we got a question. So do we have any questions?
There's a question about the South Oaks gambling screen.
Mhm.
And sorry, I'm just trying to pull my chat up and just ask if it was a valid measure.
Which one?
The South Oaks gambling screen.
Yeah, so the SOGS, right? So the SOGS is an old but goodie, right? So it's been around for a long time. I think that it's definitely, I mean, I've even published with it. I definitely would encourage you to use this measure, the Problem Gambling Severity Index, more so if you're working with a clinical sample. There's probably there's different measures like the gambling severity scale. There's other measures that might be more useful. I personally have discontinued the SOGS because it's much older, and we think about the DSM-5 criteria, and I think that there's better, stronger evidence, I would say, for looking at the continuum here with the PGSI and other measures. And for veterans, I think we've been using these, and I think this is a way to go, in my opinion. So I would say if you're using it, it's fine, but I would discontinue it and shift over pretty quickly to something newer, just because it allows you to compare your sample and things with more current, data. Relative SOGS has been kind of phased out quite a bit, actually. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
I linked in the chat, actually, we have an e-screener on our site that is the PGSI, so it's a good resource. Yeah,
and it's been nice because, a lot of these military samples, they're using it as well. So it really helps us, say, compare gambling severity. And we know gambling, even if one thing I want to take away here too is that just because you don't have gambling disorder, you don't have 4 of 9 symptoms, having even 1 symptom or 2 symptoms or struggling is a real issue, and it still can be devastating. And many people will have no issues or have a little bit of problem gambling for years until they develop what's called, gambling disorder. So I think looking at it as a continuum is really, really helpful. The good thing is that the earlier they are in that continuum, there are less severity, the better you can interact and intervene with lower intensity measure, treatments rather than like residential. So we'll talk about. So, okay. So psychotherapy. So psychotherapy works, right? So I'm a CBT psychotherapist. I love it. That's just my personal thing. But I want to say that, gamma disorder responds similar to substance use. It does work. We know that treating veterans and individuals with addictions is difficult, right? Addictions are very hard to treat. That's what I love to do, but you got to have patience and endurance, right? But things work. So recovery support systems, peer support, 12-step programs, Gamblers Anonymous, they do help. They help many people, and I think there's evidence for them. I think researchers like to kind of dismiss them, but I think that's really a mistake. At the same time, brief advice-giving psychoeducation works. Sometimes a 30-minute conversation with someone about, hey, do you really want to spend $500 this month on Keno versus how can you use that instead? And interestingly, often brief intervention can really help people think about what's their values, what do they care about, and how to shift their behavior in a positive way. So we know cognitive behavioral therapy, Dr. Petrie, who passed away years ago, did incredible work. CBT is helpful. It does work. It could be long-term or short-term. Is really helpful and useful. But gambling, like addictions, there are slips and there are relapses. And when I work with people who are struggling, I say, well, I expect you to struggle, and slips happen and relapse happens because addictions are challenging, and gambling is an addictive behavior. So I've been more recently interested in mindfulness-based relapse prevention. It's kind of a more recent thing because it's kind of a more transdiagnostic treatment, and we'll talk about that. And we published a preliminary study for gambling, and I'm going to show it to you in a second, for veterans. And we're currently doing here in Las Vegas, VA, we're testing it with multiple groups. We're going to be doing this next phase here, testing it with our veterans here to see whether it's helpful for veterans with and without problem gambling or gambling disorder and other comorbidities. So, okay. So if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to keep going. So what is mindfulness? So I mentioned I like to do mindfulness. So mindfulness is a philosophy and a practice of cultivating increased awareness of our moment-to-moment awareness, right, experience without non-judgmental way. So we, unfortunately, as humans are super judgmental. We're always thinking about the past or the future. We're never really in our moment. And part of what we want to do is slow veterans down, slow someone down, to really understand what's kind of happening in that moment, but also to really get rid of that non-judgmental, that shame, that guilt, which really, that rumination that causes them to have more issues. So the practice of mindfulness, right, you probably heard a lot about it. It was based on principles of Buddhism, but again, it was medicalized by Dr. Kabat-Zinn. It's been applied for everything. I think sometimes it gets over applied as a cure-all for everything. I do not think that's true. Doesn't mean it always works for everything, but I think it is useful for some folks. So mindfulness, and I have some resources for you to look at, but mindfulness does two things here. So one is attention. So self-regulation of attention so that it is maintained in the immediate experience, like right now as you listen to me speak, and allowing increased recognition of what's happening in the present moment. Two is an attitude, kind of an openness, practicing moment, a curiosity, openness, and acceptance. This is hard, right? We're kind of judgmental. We're not always willing to just sit with things. But what we know about gambling is you kind of have to, right? When you're struggling, you have to learn to tolerate and to work and accept some things. So a manual that we have studied and we publish is this one. If you click on the links, they'll go to these manuals. It's a mindfulness-based relapse prevention, MBRP. It's a treatment approach. It was originally started for addictions, University of Washington. It's best suited for individuals who are kind of undergone some treatment, for substance use or addictions. And it's really about kind of helping people develop a lifestyle that supports, well-being and recovery. So this is the four, key goals of it. Develop awareness of personal triggers, right? So habitual reactions, learn how to create or pause automatic thoughts. Change your relationship to discomfort, learning to recognize challenges, emotions, foster non-judgmental, compassionate approach to ourselves and others. That's really, really tough for those with gambling. And building a lifestyle that supports mindfulness and practice recovery. So these are the broad principles, which I think are, useful for all of us. The MBRP protocol is kind of based on, it's a group protocol, and it's based on 8 sessions, as you can see here. So the first 3, automatic pilot, relapse, awareness of triggers and craving, mindfulness or daily life, is really about enhancing awareness and present moment. So sessions 4, 5, and 6, mindfulness, understanding high-risk situations, acceptance of skillful action, and seeing thoughts for thoughts, right? So sometimes a thought is just a thought, doesn't mean anything. Mindfulness, and this is mindfulness and relapse. There is an element of relapse prevention. And then lastly, the last 2 sessions are self-care, kind of helping people get balance, social support, and practice. So this is kind of the content. So when I was in Bedford, Massachusetts, a number of years ago, and we have the behavioral relations clinic that I founded, we started doing MBRP because I was getting a lot of veterans coming in with a lot of issues, PTSD and substance use and problem gambling. I thought, well, hey, I need to figure out a treatment that's going to kind of hit lots of things, right? So I need something that's a broad treatment. And I thought, well, let's try this. So we engaged veterans. We published this, and this is the case series. I'm just going to show you 3 that were here for gambling. As you can see, this is the kind of typical veteran who seeks treatment, right? So we have someone older, in this case, we have Vietnam era employed, homeless, prior PTSD, high service connection. Again, we had VB, also in the 50s, Christian, Persian Gulf, veteran, unemployed, stable housing, divorce, but bipolar. And the last one was in his mid-40s. Here again, Air Force, 100% service connection, high school education, unemployed, at risk for homelessness, also schizophrenia, disorder, tobacco. So I show this because when we do these big treatment studies, often this is all people that you would screen out. And the reality is when you're serving people with gambling or veterans, they have a lot of comorbidities, a lot of issues. So you need a treatment that works for everybody. So I'm going to just show you a couple of slides, but that I think are really useful. So the first one is, it says intensity of craving. So think of this as how strong is the craving or the desire to gamble, right? Craving. And what you can see is the white box is before treatment and the post is black after treatment. And what you can see is that craving, intensity of craving goes up. And you go, oh my gosh, that seems negative. And that's actually a good thing, because when you stop gambling or you stop engaging in behaviors, you also have craving because of deprivation. Craving, intensity of craving early in treatment is normal. What matters, though, is when you look to the next box, it says number of cravings. What we see is that pre-treatment cravings are much higher. Post-treatment they're much lower, meaning they're not happening as often. That's a good thing. But what matters, the ice on the cake right here is this one, is how capable do you feel to handle the urges? So when someone wants to gamble and they're itching and they want to go out and gamble, how strong how capable are they to deal with it in that moment? And what we see is A, pretty low, but B, their confidence increase with treatment. So the A really, really feels much more confident. And what we know is that this skill is really, really necessary for treatment, right? Success. So if your clients can handle and feel confident with dealing with the urges and craving for substance use, for gambling, they're more likely to be successful with treatment. So this is why the treatment, I think, was really helpful, because, and there are other slides that I'm not going to show you in the article, but it's really about kind of building this self-efficacy to tolerate or to deal with these intense urges, in this case, to gamble when stressed, right? Okay. So what are some treatments? What are some helpful skills for treating gambling disorder? So broadly, I use a couple things. So these are things that you'll have access to. They're also part of the treatment manuals that I'm going to show you. But I really think these are really, really good. So one is using, when clients are struggling, right? We use the RAIN formula, RAIN, right? So you want to recognize when they're present with barriers. What are the hindrances that are coming up for them? In this case, to use mindfulness or meditation strategies. Accept them, right? Accept these sensations. Don't try to change them. Let them wash over you. Investigate them. Be curious around your doubts, desires, and aversions. What are they like? What's changing? Kind of have this curiosity. And lastly is N, which is non-identification of them, right? So such feelings are just passing mental events and so on, right? So, well, the reason I bring this up is often when people start treatment, they think that, oh my gosh, I'm thinking about gambling all the time. I can't stop, and they're not gambling, but they're really distressed by it. And what I hope you kind of recognize is, that's not going to change. In fact, that's probably going to stay that way, because early in treatment success, when someone's not engaging in gambling, they have deprivation, they're having those urges, and allowing them to accept that and to sit with it and to use it and to kind of be there when their body will not necessarily trigger them to use. So there's a lot of belief that if I think about it, I'll do it. And that's not necessarily true. When you separate that time and you allow someone to reflect on that and slow them down, what we know is that it gives them more confidence and ability to cope or to deal with it, right? This is why these mindfulness protocols are successful. So another one is a really great technique. I use this across the board for lots of things. This could be useful for someone with PTSD. It could also be for gambling, anything. It's called the grounding technique. It's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So 5. So acknowledge 5 things you see around you. This could be a pen, a spot on the ceiling, anything. Number 4, acknowledge 4 things you can touch around you. Your hair, pillow, anything like that, right? Acknowledge 3 things you can hear, all right? What are those sources? What are the sounds? Focus on that. 2, acknowledge 2 things you can smell, right? Maybe in your office, where they are located. And 1, acknowledge 1 thing you can taste. So what we know is that the senses for people, what we smell, what we see, what we touch, what we feel, really help us ground. And when some people are struggling with gambling in that moment, what we want to do is have some techniques to slow them down, get them present centered, and really kind of in touch with what's going on. So these are things that we practice in groups, but also in psychotherapy. I would recommend this for those with broad addictions as a really useful strategy to help people kind of slow down moment to moment. So we mentioned this earlier, high-risk situations. So if you're going to treat people with gambling issues, right, and other things, you kind of have to figure out, like, what are the gambling situations that are there really high risk for them? And this is like negative emotions, conflict with others, pleasant emotions, social pressure, need for excitement, right? Places associated with past use, exhaustion, which I think is kind of like a negative mood, having cash on hand, that's a big one, testing personal control and urges to patients. So part of this is when you're working with people with struggling, I would understand what is a high-risk situation. Not everyone might need to gamble or feel gambling if they have exhaustion or if they see a trigger or a reminder of a place or a situation. But again, you really have to think about what's specific to that person and individual. With veterans, negative emotions, right? So we say, well, why do people who are veterans often gamble? It's negative emotion, coping often with other mental health issues such as PTSD and depression and negative moods. They gamble to escape. The escapism is very much number one in negative emotions here. So you have to target that as well in treatment to have them be successful. So this is a manual that is free and available. It's currently, it was made in Canada. It's quite awesome, actually. The website has all 8 sessions or PDFs. They even have videos. It's pretty amazing on how to do practice exercises. They've incorporated yoga. I would really recommend you consider looking at this. We are currently adapting this protocol here in VA because, it's not adapted for veterans, and you want material to really speak to the cultural considerations we want for our veterans. So we are currently adapting this right now. And we're hoping in the next year, we'll be rolling that out free and available for all people who want to provide treatment for gambling for veterans. But this is a great manual. If you have a treatment program, I would recommend you doing this and checking this out. It's a nice 8-session group protocol or individual. So you probably know this. These are some resources here so here in Las Vegas, we actually have a residential problem gambling program. It's the second one in the country. Cleveland has another one. This is also just providing, you probably know these things, but the 1-800-GAMBLER, as well as I provided here, we have the New York number, as well as the New York VA locator for if you're working with veterans as well. So I'm actually doing a study. So we are funded by the Cambridge Institute. We are currently recruiting. So if you know a veteran or active duty member who is currently struggling with gambling or has had gambling issues in the past, we are recruiting. We've interviewed 8 veterans so far. We're trying to get to 40, and we're recruiting them to understand what were the challenges and barriers they experienced while in the military or currently as an active duty, because I can't really change policy and things if I don't know what our service members or our veterans are experiencing as barriers to care for in active duty and DoD, or if they're actually in the VA or our community. So this is an actual study we're recruiting for right now. If you know of anyone in this, please, our lab email is there. My name is on that. I'm happy to connect. This has been IRB approved. It's a journey here. We're doing this, but we're hoping by next summer to have interviewed 40 veterans, men and women, all backgrounds, to really try to make some changes here for veterans and for our service folks. So this is my information. I'm going to open up to questions. I think we actually have time, and let's do that.
All right, thank you so much. Anybody have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. If you want to unmute and ask a question, you're more than welcome to do that as well.
Yeah, let's do that. All right, don't be shy, people. Please, don't be shy. Any questions, or does anyone have any challenges or anything they're curious about? Or
Hi, I'm curious about the manual that you just posted. Did you say that will be available at some point for download, or is that available now, the mindfulness base?
So this one, yeah. So I'm going to go back to this one is available right now. When you get these slides, if you click on that link, you'll get the manual right there, the website.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we're just, for veterans, we want to, some of this scenarios are a little different, and, we're testing it, and our veterans like, that doesn't work for me. And I'm like, yes. So part of it is when you're working with military, you want to kind of make sure that the strategies and skills work, right? You got to make sure it works for the population. So, but this one broadly is great. Like I recommend it. It's very good. So, and it's free too. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll take that into consideration. Thank you.
And then we are going to have all of these slides up on the training center. So when you guys log in, if you go to my courses, you click on this and you go to resources, the slides will be there. And as Dr. Kraus said, a lot of these are like clickable links. So you'll be able to go through and click on them to access those.
Yeah, and also my email's in there. If you ever have questions, I'm happy to help. I do think it's exciting to see so many people here, and I think that these are things to think about. I think the takeaway I always tell people is, I wasn't doing this research, 6 or 7 years ago, but I do a lot of research in other areas, and I just kept getting all these veterans and people seeking help for gambling. I thought, what is going on? And boy, we started asking questions, and we really started seeing some issues here. And some of them have had these issues for 15, 20 years. So I think this is something for us to think about. And with our active duty, we do have a sample working on. Their gambling rates are much higher, like twice. They're very, very high. So I think that's another area we need to be thinking about, right? For sports wagering and online gambling. So, yeah.
We did have 2 more questions come in. The first one from Erwin, and he said, did you conduct any studies on family members of veterans?
So not yet. So that is so we're doing this study right now, and we want to eventually broaden it to interview spouses and family members, because it's really hard to get people to be interviewed. I mean, we've done a lot of work to get this confidential, a lot of things to protect people's identity, and it's been really challenging to get people who have been struggling. And we want to go down that road because I think gambling is affecting families and all this. That is something in the next 2 years I'll be doing heavily on for sure. It's just, yeah, this is the first qualitative study of its kind ever in the country. So it's very big, yeah, project. So, and we're learning so much already. It's incredible what we're learning. So yeah.
One thing, could you go back to your contact info? Someone was just asking that in the chat. And then another question came in from Narina. Do you know of any study results with a larger number of participants showing the effectiveness of mindfulness relapse prevention?
Yeah, so mindfulness, the reason I use this manual is that, so if you go back, this manual has been well published. So some of the first major papers were published in JAMA Psychiatry. They are fantastic. So this has been well studied as a randomized clinical trial. So meaning, does it really work better than, say, classic CBT or other things? It's comparable. It's been well studied. I would have not started. I went to the literature to say what's really working well for addictions, substance use, but hasn't been studied with gambling. And that was where we kind of said, let's shift that towards gambling. But yes, MBRP, this manual, and the other manual that's free is based on this manual. They just took this manual and they made it for gambling. Great. So this manual, which is great, is gold standard. It's absolutely fantastic. It's been well published, very high scholarship for sure. Yeah, if that answers the question. And then what happened is a couple of years later, they said, hey, let's adapt it for gambling. And in Canada, and they got a grant in Canada, and they made the treatment manual, if that makes sense. I don't know where it went. I think there it is. So they made this one based on that because they found that substance use is different. You need to adapt some of the situations for gambling specifically.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Two more questions coming in. So from Mark, any thoughts on the gambling in horse racing, or is that lumped in with sports betting? Because Saratoga Racetrack is a big industry here in the capital region.
Yeah, so I think so. That's been definitely always been in sports. I think though so many tracks are closing and kind of phasing down. So I haven't seen too much. I think that was an issue, but I think so many dog tracks and horse races are really closing quite a bit. So I think that's part of sports. We haven't, in our national studies, when we look at 4,000 or 5,000 people, we see very few people. We're seeing more sports wagering on terms of sports, football, things like that. So that's really where it's at right now, football, basketball, we're just not seeing a lot of people doing horse races. It's very, very small. It's still devastatingly horrible for them when they have issues, but it's just, I would say it's declining quite a bit and it's being replaced by other things. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Another question from Carol, any research on using equine assisted therapy with veterans? They use it with problem gambling in Rhode Island for mindfulness and being present in the moment and noticing senses.
Yeah, I don't know that that's been well, from research studied, but I think that sounds great. I think, and if you think about, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, there's a lot of comorbidity. I think getting people to be present, focused is empowering, right? Because I think what happens is people with gambling issues often are coping, are just automatic pilot, they're gambling, they're at the casino when they're stressed. And if we can get them to do something moment to moment in a positive, healthy way, engaging with social people, how's that not a good thing, right? I think that makes sense to me. That sounds very much mindfulness based, right? I think it's helpful though to make sure you're applying the skills still to gambling, right? I think a lot of people with gambling issues struggle to really deal with craving and urges. And I think when I tell people that's normal, if you're not having craving or urges early on, then maybe you're not really being honest. And when I tell them I kind of think you should be, they're like, oh, because we know from the neuroimaging and all the work that this is very much how the brain works in terms of gambling, right? So, and how do we get them out of that moment to moment and get them in a healthier situation? I think it's great. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think that coupled with some stuff would be helpful,
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? And Carol just said that they team their mental health professional with the equine specialist.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, exactly. I think gambling, I think it's incredible. It's untreatable. I think what we're not doing a very good job with right now, and I think even the VA, I think we're getting there, is we haven't been interacting. We're not really doing enough, I think, on the public health kind of prevention knowledge. You know, we have all this, so many advertisement now for sports wagering and lots of things, right? So we're not really kind of having this messaging and thinking about it. And I think we're kind of ready to treat the person 8 years later, 10 years later, but I would much rather have those conversations from public health outreach and early intervention with your community partners, you know, when they're just maybe noticing they're struggling a little bit, because that's going to be much easier to work on. And I think we're still not there. You know, I think MBRP works well, it's helpful, but I think it's probably for someone who has more serious gambling versus sometimes a 90-minute session, just sitting down with someone and talking about their values and their life and what they want and how gambling is maybe not helping them is enough for them to shift their focus for some people. And that's what we're not doing, right? We're not having those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone doesn't have any more questions, I'm going to put the certificate instructions in the chat. Dr. Kraus, thank you so much. Oh, we did have one more. Any suggestions on how to get more people into treatment from Steve Block?
Okay, so I would say that I think, okay, a couple things. One is we need to continue to really talk about, like, I am always shocked. So here in Nevada, we have 5 treatment programs. We have free treatment. If you know, it's nice. We have a couple $1 million budget. And I am shocked that I meet all these people and they say, we have free treatment. And I'm like, yeah, for you, your family member, anyone who's been affected. So I think we need to do a better job of providing resources and knowledge, because people just don't know. I think unlike people also, most people don't know that gambling is an addiction. They think it's a morally bad behavior. So I think we have to change that from public health. We really have to really work more on that. And then I would reach out to partners and family, because I think most likely the partner or family member knows there's a problem, and engaging them to bring the person in. Like, people come and say, I don't have a problem. And I'm thinking, but their partner is like, well, you spent $50,000. And that's okay that they're not there. How do we then engage them and engage that family? So I would be working out more with spouses, partners, family members in the community, because they're probably seeing it sooner than the person. It's not unusual for someone to say, I don't have a problem, because they're just in it. You know, if you're in it, you're in it. It's really hard to see on the outside. And that's not a judgment of who that person is. It just speaks to what addiction is for someone who's struggling, right? So.
Well, thank you very much. This was extremely informative. Lots of comments in the chat box. Just thank you for the presentation. For everyone who is still here, these slides will be available on the training center. We also did record this presentation, and probably in a week or so, we will have it up on our YouTube page. Credits won't be available for that, but obviously, if you just want to rewatch it, get some more information or share it with someone, that will be available. If anybody has any questions, you can reach out to me at nycpgtraining@nycpg.org. Thank you again, everyone, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.